In 1934, Franklin Delano Roosevelt took a holiday that existed in only a handful of states and turned it into Columbus Day. Now, Christopher Columbus has long been beloved by Italian Americans who think of him as Marco Polo or Neil Armstrong. Native Americans, on the other hand, have a very different view. They think of him a lot more as Joseph Stalin or Adolf Hitler. In South America, Columbus Day is actually called the Day of Indigenous Resistance, celebrating the natives' attempts to resist the conquering Europeans. Now, whichever side you take, one thing is certain. The view that is taught in American schools is utter horseshit. Christopher Columbus is almost nothing like what we teach our children in schools today. It's myth, it's fabricated, it's there just so that we can have a hero to look up to. Almost none of it's true, including but not limited to his name. Christopher Columbus was a pseudonym. We don't know who he actually was, but the best evidence that I've seen, including handwriting analysis, suggests that he was actually Salvador Fernandez Zarco, the illegitimate son of Duke Fernando of Beja and Isabella Goncalves Zarco of Portugal. Fleeing his reputation as a bastard child, Salvador Zarco left his hometown of Cuba, Portugal, and simply vanished. He was never seen or heard from again. But shortly after that, Christopher Columbus, the genius navigator from Genoa, Italy, arrived on the scene. Now, contrary to popular belief, at the time Columbus set sail, everybody who was educated knew that the earth was round. The Greek mathematician Eratosthenes had actually correctly calculated the size and shape of the earth about 200 years before Jesus Christ was even born. And there were a number of other well-accepted proofs, including lunar eclipses and the fact that every time a ship set sail, the last thing you would see was the top of the mast as it went over the curvature of the earth. In fact, the year Columbus set sail was also the year German mapmaker German Behem invented the globe. So they all knew it was round. The question wasn't what was the shape of the earth. The question was, how big was it? At the time, textiles and spices from India were highly valued, but the only way to get them was to go through Turkey. And Turkey was always having uprisings, rebellions, insurrections. You could get robbed, murdered. It was a dangerous route to take, even in the best of times. A sea route would be far more profitable, faster, and less dangerous. Based on current calculations, it was assumed that a route to India would be about 60 days by sea. Now, at most, a ship could only hold about 40 or 45 days of food and water. Then along came Columbus, who said, no, those calculations were wrong, and he had calculated the size of the earth such that a route to India by sea would take 30 days. Now, that created an interesting situation because ships could realistically only explore about 20 days out. The reason is they would need half their food and water to come back. At 30 days, you would already be past the point of no return. You would either find land or everybody would starve to death. This meant that the lives of anybody on any voyage based on Christopher Columbus's numbers would be betting their lives that those numbers are correct. Now, because of the dangers involved and because of the fact that nobody actually believed he knew what he was talking about, most countries refused to fund this voyage despite the rewards involved. Finally, the Queen of Spain accepted his proposal for the voyage and promised him the title of Grand Admiral of the Ocean, governorship over any lands that he discovered, and 10% of the revenue from all those lands. Columbus set sail on August 3rd, 1492, with a reward of 10,000 maravedillas for the first person to spot land. 30 days came and went, no land. 31, 32, 33. His crew started to get upset. They started to think that perhaps his numbers were wrong. Mutiny started being bandied about, including killing Christopher Columbus and turning around in a desperate bid to try to get back alive. Then, on the 36th day, a sailor by the name of Rodrigo de Triana saw land from the crow's nest of the Pinta. There was a huge celebration. Cannons from all three ships were fired. But when de Triana tried to get his reward, Christopher Columbus stepped in and said, no, I saw the land the night before. Columbus lied and said he had seen the land and took the reward from de Triana. Now, it's commonly thought that the land that they had seen was North America, but in fact it wasn't. It wasn't South America either. It was the Bahamas. Now, the Bahamas are the only pieces of land, these tiny islands between Europe and the Americas. Just these little tiny islands. They're almost impossible to hit. Landing on the Bahamas is like looking for a haystack and coming up with a needle instead. The island that he landed on was called Guanahani, but when he got there, he claimed it for the Spanish and renamed it San Salvador after Salvador Zarco. Christopher Columbus really did think that he was in India. He called these lands the Indies, and the people he met there Indians. He chronicled what he did once he arrived in what can only be described as acts of rape, murder, and genocide. His mindset from the day he arrived was pretty clear. Quote, "They brought us parrots and balls of cotton and spears and many other things. They willingly traded everything they owned. They were well built, with good bodies and handsome features. They do not bear arms and do not know them, for I showed them a sword. They took it by the edge and cut themselves out of ignorance. They have no iron. Their spears are made of cane. They would make fine servants. With 50 men we could subjugate them all and make them do what we want. As soon as I arrived in the Indies, on the first island which I found, I took some of the natives by force, in order that they might give me whatever information there is in these parts." The information he wanted was what was their source of gold. Many of them had on gold jewelry, and he assumed that this meant that gold was plentiful in the area. They said that they didn't have much of it, but what they did have, they had found on another nearby island, which they took him to. That island he named after Zarco's hometown of Cuba. But try as he might, he couldn't find any gold there, so he loaded up his ships with as many slaves as he could and went back to Spain. The fact that he came back alive was a great shock to most people, but to none more than one particular Italian mapmaker. This mapmaker had also calculated the size of the Earth, but unlike Columbus, had gotten it correctly. So when Columbus came back alive, he knew that there was something there between India and Europe. He created an expedition to go out and try to find what was there and to map it. This mapmaker landed on North America on April 10th in 1497. His name was Amerigo Vespucci. The Queen of Spain was also not as pleased as one might expect. He brought back slaves, but she wasn't interested in slaves. They had value, but not as much as the spices and textiles that he had been sent to go find. Further, she didn't want to enslave the natives. She wanted to convert them to Christianity. Columbus, knowing that he wouldn't get another trip unless there was something in it for the Queen, said, "Oh, sorry, I thought you wanted slaves. There's gold in every mountain, in every stream, in every river. There's gold everywhere. If only I had known. Send me back, and I will get it for you." She believed him, and this time sent him with 17 ships to go back and collect the gold, with the caveat that he maintain peaceful and friendly relations with the natives. However, on his second trip, he found no more gold than the first. He decided that he needed to motivate the natives, so he created a quota system. Every native over the age of 14 had to collect gold. Any native that met their quota would be given a copper ring to wear around their neck. At the end of the week, if a native was found not wearing a copper ring, they would cut off his hands. Well, the natives knew full well there wasn't enough gold to make this quota, even for the first week, so they did the only thing they could. They fled. Columbus saw this as a betrayal and hunted them down. Any that they found, they hung or burned alive. The natives did try to resist, but as Columbus had pointed out, they didn't have swords, they couldn't make armor, they didn't have horses, and they certainly had no idea what a musket was. And the Spanish had become so ferocious that when cornered at the edge of the island with nowhere to go, the natives would poison their children and then commit suicide rather than be captured by the Spanish. In just under 2 years, 10,000 natives were slaughtered. This represented the entire population of some of the smaller islands. Columbus established a fort in Hispaniola and captured 16,000 Arawak Native Americans. Most were kept as slaves, women and children were raped, and Columbus himself wrote about using the slaves for sex and for sword practice. He took 550 of these slaves back with him to Spain. More than half of them died on the trip, and within another 2.5 years, 250,000 Native Americans were dead. Now, it turns out that mutilation, murder, burning alive, hanging, and slavery didn't fall under the umbrella of what the Queen called friendly relations with the natives, and she freed all of the slaves that he had brought. Nonetheless, on accounts again of gold in every river, every stream, she agreed to give him one more voyage with 6 ships to try to get back the gold, the spices, the textiles. However, she sent with him a priest, Bartolome de las Casas, to keep an eye on him, and he was empowered to arrest Columbus if he should get out of control. Las Casas would later publish a short account of the destruction of the Indies. He wrote, "Endless testimonies prove the mild and pacifistic temperament of the natives. But our work was to exacerbate, ravage, kill, mangle, and destroy. Small wonder, then, if they tried to kill one of us now and then. The admiral, it's true, was as blind as those who came after him, and he was so anxious to please the king that he committed irreparable crimes against the Indians." Las Casas also described how the Spaniards would ride on the backs of the Indians and test the sharpness of their blades. He wrote, quote, "They thought nothing of knifing Indians by 10s and 20s, and of cutting slices off of them to test the sharpness of their blades." 2 of these so-called Christians met 2 Indian boys on one day, each carrying a parrot. They took the parrots and, for fun, beheaded the boys. Columbus had set out with sailors, not with soldiers, and when the promised gold and riches wasn't there, they got upset. The fort was near rebellion by the time Columbus returned, and many of his men were talking again of mutiny. So Columbus solved this in the only way he could think of. He began to hang them. Las Casas then arrested Columbus and sent him back in shackles. When he arrived home, utterly disgraced, the crown stripped him of his title. They stripped him of his governorships, and they stripped him of all the monies he was entitled to from his expeditions. They threw him in jail and forgot about him until eventually, convinced that letting him go would be the Christian thing to do, he was released. He gathered together all the money he could for one more private expedition. It was as much a failure as all the previous ones. Columbus died in disgrace. In 4 trips across the ocean, he never once set foot on North America, and set foot on South America only once on his 3rd trip. And by that point, Amerigo Vespucci had spent a year mapping the entire east coast of North America. So where does this legend of Christopher Columbus come from? It comes from 2 places. The first is the American Revolution. At the time, he was a footnote in European exploration, but Phyllis Wheatley, a 14-year-old free African-American girl, had written a poem which included a reference to Columbus to George Washington. Now, he didn't really care about Columbus, but he did like the poem, so he spread it around. People started asking more about this Columbus, and Columbus was turned into a hero. He was turned into this guy who had sacrificed everything to create this new world that they were now fighting for. And Columbus's name became almost as powerful as that of George Washington. Then things really exploded when a writer named Washington Irving came onto the scene. Now, Irving had written Rip Van Winkle and The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, but he wanted to cement himself as an all-American writer, and people were asking, who is this Christopher Columbus? So Irving created a new genre, the romantic biography. He turned Christopher Columbus into a figure of worship, into this all-American legend. And in order to do so, he was liberal with a number of facts, and he ignored a number of inconvenient truths. He burnished Columbus's credentials and achievements, including saying that Christopher Columbus had been the first person to prove that the Earth was round. Now, there was no internet back then, no fact-checking, no Google, so this history of Columbus went unchallenged for about 150 years. It wasn't until Howard Zinn, author of The People's History of the United States, we started to get a very good look at the real history of Christopher Columbus. Even now, it's only slowly starting to seep into the American consciousness that the Christopher Columbus that we know is a fabrication on multiple fronts. Las Casas wrote that from 1494 to 1508, nearly 3 million people perished from war and slavery. Those figures are probably high, owing to an inability to actually create a scientific study to measure just how many people were killed. Current estimates are that it was closer to 500,000. Does this put Columbus in the same league as Joseph Stalin or Adolf Hitler? No. It is the same ball game, though. And one has to ask, what would Columbus have done if he had 1940s German technology and manpower? In war, it's always advantageous to create heroes, to create fictions, to galvanize the people and make them willing to die for something bigger than themselves. Christopher Columbus was born out of the Revolutionary War as a mythical hero worthy of worship, to whom we now have statues, and in 1934 was canonized by Franklin Delano Roosevelt as a national holiday. Thank you.